A racist police officer charges at a black woman, harasses her, and throws handcuffs on her wrists as if she were nothing. What he doesn't know is that she's an FBI agent, and what's coming for him will not only destroy his career but send shockwaves through the entire city. It started on an ordinary morning, or at least that's what it looked like. The woman had just parked her car in front of a commercial building camouflaged as a financial consulting office. She looked professional, composed, focused. She had her credentials tucked in her coat, her earpiece in place, and a sealed document folder under her arm, because this wasn't just another day, it was a covert surveillance operation authorized by the federal government. What she didn't expect was to be the one who'd end up under surveillance, and not by a criminal, but by the very people who claimed to serve and protect. As she stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, she noticed the police cruiser pull up behind her. She barely gave it any attention. After all, she wasn't breaking any law. But that didn't matter. A white officer stepped out with eyes already full of suspicion, hand resting on his holster. No greeting. No inquiry. Just the cold, sharp voice of authority shaped by bias and a sense of entitlement. "Hey! What do you think you're doing here? This isn't your kind of place," he snapped, not even hiding the contempt in his tone. She turned slowly, calm, measured, ready to de-escalate. But he wasn't looking for an explanation. He wanted to assert dominance. "I'm going inside to see a colleague," she replied, her voice even, her posture unthreatening. "You got ID? What's in that folder? You stealing something?" "You don't belong here," he interrupted, taking a step closer, now towering over her. "I work here," she said, firmer now, not backing down. "Bullshit," he spat, and in one quick, humiliating motion, he grabbed her by the wrist, turned her around, and shoved her against the hood of her car. "Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest," he shouted, loud enough for everyone in the parking lot to turn and watch. People walking by stopped. Phones came out. Some pointed. Some laughed. Others looked away. But not one stepped in. The cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around her wrists as her cheek pressed against the hot car hood. She looked ahead, jaw clenched, breath stuck somewhere between fury and humiliation. He never asked for her name. Never looked at the badge inside her jacket. Never thought for a second that she could be someone with power. He just saw a black woman in a nice part of town and decided she didn't deserve to be there. "You're gonna learn not to run your mouth around officers, sweetheart," he sneered, dragging her toward his cruiser. And as she sat in the back seat, cuffed like a criminal, her eyes didn't show fear. They showed calculation. She wasn't panicking, she was watching, memorizing, collecting evidence. Because she knew something he didn't. The building they were in front of wasn't just another office. It was an undercover FBI surveillance base. And everything, every single second, had been recorded by a high-resolution federal surveillance camera hidden in the parking lot light pole. Audio included. She could have blown her cover right there. She could have shown her badge, revealed her clearance, and made the scene stop. But she didn't. She let him keep talking. Let him insult. Let him expose himself. Because she knew this wasn't about just her. This wasn't the first time he'd done this. And it wouldn't be the last, unless someone made it the last. What he thought was a routine power trip was, in reality, the beginning of his unraveling. Because the footage didn't just capture the assault. It captured the truth, the way he ignored her words, the way he weaponized the badge against someone he didn't even see as a human being. And once that footage reached the FBI's Internal Affairs Unit, once the agents upstairs watched the entire interaction unfold, the question wasn't if he'd be punished, it was how far up the rot would go. Back at the station, he bragged about it. Laughed with his buddies. Said she cried like all the others. Wrote up a fake report claiming she resisted, called her aggressive, dangerous. But what happens when your lie is up against federal video evidence, time-stamped and verified? What happens when you try to criminalize a federal agent in the middle of a classified operation? The answer is simple: everything falls apart. Because what started as a humiliating, dehumanizing moment in a parking lot became a national scandal. Internal investigations revealed he had a pattern: altered arrest reports, falsified evidence, complaints that were buried, names of innocent black residents who'd had their lives ruined because of his abuse of power. And as the truth exploded into the public eye, the city began to reckon with itself. Headlines dominated every news outlet. People took to the streets. The footage went viral. A badge was no longer enough to shield him. His career disintegrated in real time, and the woman he tried to silence became the symbol of justice he never imagined he'd face. But even then, even with everything exposed, even as the world watched him fall, there was still something he didn't know. Something about that folder she was holding. Something about why she was there that day. Something much bigger than just him. Something that would change more than just one life. What was she really investigating that day? And why was he the one who triggered everything? You think you know what justice looks like? Just wait. Now tell me. Are you ready to hear the full story? Before we begin, a quick but important message: here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, we see you, we support you, and your voice matters. Stories like this are told not just to entertain, but to remind the world of the realities many face, and the power of truth and justice. Enjoy the story. And if this resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It means everything. Her name was Ayanna Brooks, and nothing in her life had ever come easily: not respect, not peace, not even space to exist without judgment. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, she was the middle child of a fiercely proud single mother who worked nights cleaning corporate offices and spent her days volunteering in community legal clinics. From her mother, Ayanna inherited a resilience made of steel and a moral compass that didn't bend under pressure. Her journey to becoming a special agent for the FBI wasn't just about credentials or qualifications, it was about surviving a system that wasn't built for her, and then learning how to outsmart it from the inside. Ayanna didn't walk into rooms. She entered with purpose. Her presence was deliberate, her eyes sharp, always reading the space, measuring people's words before they spoke them. She had learned early on that power wasn't about volume or physicality, it was about control, and she mastered the art of holding it in silence. But even with a badge, a gun, and federal clearance, she knew one truth would never change: in the eyes of many, she was still just a black woman who needed to be reminded of her place. Now 37, Ayanna lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city with booming development, old Southern roots, and a growing tension between progress and history. She had transferred there from D.C. 2 years prior, assigned to an undercover unit investigating racial profiling and civil rights violations within law enforcement. It was the kind of assignment that required not only skill and caution but deep emotional fortitude. It meant seeing the rot up close. It meant walking into precincts where the walls still carried the energy of generations of abuse, smiling through clenched teeth as she watched officers toast to taking the streets back, without ever mentioning who they were taking them back from. The building where she worked wasn't listed on any FBI directory. Outwardly, it posed as a corporate financial consultancy, a gray glass office nestled between a boutique bank and a frozen yogurt shop in a wealthy business district. Inside, however, was a maze of security doors, facial recognition points, and agents moving through layers of highly sensitive information. Ayanna had spent the last 8 months embedded in a task force tasked with gathering hard evidence of discriminatory policing. She reviewed arrest reports, flagged patterns, chased internal complaints that were buried by bureaucracy, and followed officers off duty. Her mission wasn't just observation, it was exposure. And it required absolute secrecy. Her cover life was designed to be invisible. She drove a basic sedan, dressed professionally but without flash, and used a name that didn't appear in any public FBI database. No one outside the unit knew what she did, not even her own neighbors. She walked a careful line between existing and hiding in plain sight. It wasn't the kind of job that earned her public applause. It was lonely work. But Ayanna never sought praise. She sought accountability. Across town, in a very different world, Officer Darren Whitaker had his own rhythm. A decorated officer on paper, Darren was the kind of man people in his precinct called old school. He prided himself on being tough on crime, which for him meant hypersurveillance of black and brown neighborhoods, aggressive stops, and a refusal to second-guess his instincts, even when they were wrong. Darren had been on the force for 17 years. He wore his uniform like armor and believed the badge gave him the right to define who belonged and who didn't. His charm masked a deeply embedded bitterness, resentment toward change, toward what he saw as woke politics, and toward any outsider who questioned the way things had always been done. He had complaints on his record, allegations of excessive force, wrongful arrests, but nothing ever stuck. Internal affairs never pursued hard. Witnesses disappeared. Reports got lost. In his mind, he was untouchable. And that made him dangerous. Darren lived in a suburban house with a perfectly mowed lawn and a flagpole out front. He drank beer from a cooler while watching game replays in his garage and had a thin-lipped smile he reserved for black men he pulled over late at night. To the world, he was a family man, a public servant. But Ayanna knew better. She had reviewed his cases. She had seen how he altered incident reports, how he justified pat-downs by smelling marijuana, that no other officer could verify, how he arrested teenagers for resisting arrest when no arrest should have happened in the first place. On the morning that would change everything, Ayanna arrived at the office early. Her task that day wasn't fieldwork, it was document transport. A sealed envelope containing transcripts and surveillance footage needed to be reviewed by another agent upstairs. Simple enough. She wore her usual attire, clean-cut slacks, a dark blazer, hair pinned back. No badge visible. No weapon in sight. She looked like what she was trained to look like, nondescript. She parked on the far side of the lot, away from cameras, out of habit more than necessity. The day was bright, with a crisp chill in the air. The kind of day that felt ordinary, but would soon crack open into chaos. Darren had been circling that neighborhood since sunrise. Not on duty, off the books, bored, bitter from an argument at home. He liked to patrol the good parts of town, to make his presence known. When he saw Ayanna stepping out of her car with a document folder in hand, he slowed. Watched. Something in her confidence unsettled him. He didn't recognize her face. She didn't look nervous. She didn't smile. She walked like she had somewhere important to be, and that, for Darren, was enough to feel threatened. He pulled up behind her with his lights flashing, even though there was no emergency. Ayanna heard the engine, turned slightly, and kept walking. She'd dealt with officers like this before, but she had work to do. Still, his voice barked across the lot. Stop. Right there. Ayanna paused, turned, raised an eyebrow. She kept her expression neutral. You got ID? He asked, stepping out of the car with that swagger of assumed authority. I'm going into my building, she replied calmly, not showing even a flicker of nervousness. Which building? What do you do? I work in finance. I'm late for a meeting. Finance? Funny, never seen you around here. I'm not required to check in with you. Wrong answer. His face hardened, and he stepped closer, hand drifting toward his belt. He was scanning her like prey, looking for the smallest reason to escalate. Open your bag, he ordered. I don't consent to a search. Oh, you don't consent, he repeated, mocking. Then I'll take that as resisting. Turn around. It didn't matter what she said next. He had already decided. In his eyes, she was a problem to be handled, not a person to be heard. And as his hand closed around her arm and forced her against the hood of her own car, Ayanna didn't fight. Not physically. She let him talk. Let him push. Let him write the story of his own downfall with every arrogant word. The cameras from the building above captured it all. And yet, even as she sat in the back of his cruiser, hands cuffed behind her, the real weight of the moment didn't fall on her shoulders. It fell on his. Because Ayanna wasn't just a target. She was a trap. Not one she had planned, but one that had built itself out of his choices, his prejudice, his belief that power meant never being questioned. And soon, that belief would shatter. What Darren Whitaker didn't know was that this encounter wasn't isolated. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't just another bad day. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And Ayanna Brooks wasn't just a woman he'd humiliated. She was a federal agent carrying evidence, armed not with vengeance, but with truth. The question now wasn't whether justice would come. It was how far the damage would go once it did. And what exactly was in that sealed envelope she never got to deliver. The precinct was cold. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The kind of cold that crept into your bones not from the air conditioning, but from the silence of a place where truth was an inconvenience. Ayanna sat in the holding room, her wrists sore from the tight metal cuffs, her hair slightly disheveled from the way she'd been shoved into the cruiser, but her eyes were unmoved. They didn't beg. They didn't plead. They observed. Memorized. Calculated. She had been in rooms like this before, but never from this side of the table. And yet, even now, with fluorescent lights flickering above and a two-way mirror hiding eyes she couldn't see, she wasn't scared. She was thinking. And waiting. Outside the room, Darren stood by the coffee machine, grinning as he recounted the arrest to Officer Mooney, one of his regular partners. He exaggerated the way she resisted, the attitude she gave him, how he had no choice but to restrain her. Mooney chuckled, shaking his head as if this kind of story was routine, because for them, it was. No one questioned why Darren had made the stop. No one asked for footage. No one looked at her ID. They didn't need to. In their minds, the story had already been told. People think they can just walk around like they own the damn place, Darren said, sipping his coffee without shame. But not on my beat. Not today. Back in the room, Ayanna leaned back, testing the range of the chain bolted to the floor. She didn't look at the camera in the corner, but she knew it was there. She hoped it was working. There was no telling what would happen next, no guarantee they wouldn't dig too deep and discover who she was before she had the chance to control the fallout. She needed to buy time. Needed someone to notice she hadn't reported back. The envelope, God, the envelope, she had left it in the car, sealed and marked. If someone from the unit came looking, if they tracked her GPS, they'd find it. But until then, she had to stay invisible. Hours passed. No charges. No phone call. Just silence and glances from the hallway. She was a ghost in the system, by their doing and her design. Eventually, a sergeant entered, clipboard in hand, clearing his throat like a formality. He looked her over with brief, dismissive eyes. You refused to provide ID, were uncooperative, and loitering on private property, he recited, monotone. That's what Officer Whitaker documented. I was standing outside my office building, Ayanna said, calmly but firmly. I stated that clearly. Several times. Which office? Brooks and Lang Financial. Suite 402. The sergeant paused, squinted, and scribbled something. You don't work there. No. Ayanna tilted her head. Would you like to search their employee database? He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and exited. She could feel the crack forming. Small, but there. A sliver of doubt. Enough. That evening, while the sun set outside and shadows grew across the precinct walls, Ayanna's phone, still in her coat, in the property locker, lit up with calls from Agent Morales, her partner on the task force. Then Agent Quinn. Then Assistant Director Mills. All missed. All escalating. At the unit's headquarters, Morales was pacing. He hadn't heard from Ayanna in over 6 hours. Her last message had been a quick update, on site. Handoff at 10:45. That was all. And then, nothing. Her car GPS showed her parked outside the front entrance, but she never entered the building. That wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. Pull the surveillance feed, Morales ordered one of the tech analysts. A minute later, on a wide screen, they saw her. Ayanna stepping out of her car, adjusting her blazer, walking toward the door. Then the police cruiser pulling in. The confrontation. The grab. The cuffs. The push. And the expression on her face, steady, unreadable, waiting. The room fell silent. Pause that, Morales said. They froze on the frame of Darren Whitaker pressing her against the hood, arms twisted behind her. That son of a, Morales didn't finish the sentence. He grabbed his badge, his jacket, and the envelope she'd never delivered. In it, files that tied several officers, including Whitaker, to suspicious incident patterns over a 6-year span. Fabricated charges. Convenient resistance justifications. Always the same demographic. Always the same tone in the reports. It wasn't random. It was systemic. Back at the precinct, Darren was still bragging. Even as the sergeant came back with a stiff face, trying to conceal a sliver of concern, Darren stood tall, proud of another day's work. "You're gonna love this," he said. "She told me she works in finance. Real high and mighty. You know the type." "Darren," the sergeant said slowly, "did you check the building records?" "Didn't need to." She was lying. You could smell it. The sergeant didn't respond. He handed over a folder. Inside was a printout, a lease document. Brooks and Lang Financial. Tenant listed, Ayanna Brooks. Darren's face twitched. "She could have forged that," he muttered. "Her ID was in her coat. Real one. She's in the system." You said she resisted." "She did. There's footage." Those 2 words changed everything. Suddenly, the weight of the badge wasn't behind him, it was pressing down on his back. Still, Darren straightened his posture. She still disrespected a police officer. That's interference. That's not going to hold, Darren. They didn't say more. They didn't have to. The tension in the room was suffocating. In the holding room, Ayanna sat still, watching the slow unraveling through the glass reflection. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Morales entered, followed by 2 federal agents. No uniform. No words at first. Just a look. Ayanna didn't blink. "Agent Brooks," Morales finally said. "Are you all right?" She gave a tight nod. The cuffs were removed without ceremony. Outside, Darren saw the agents. Heard her name. And something in him cracked, not loudly, not visibly. But inside, where pride had once inflated his sense of superiority, there was now a slow leak. A panic he couldn't show. Not yet. As Ayanna walked out with Morales, past the officers who had laughed at her, past the sergeant who had looked through her, no one said a word. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Back at headquarters, she sat with Morales and Quinn in the conference room as they reviewed the footage. Every second of the incident. Every movement. Every lie he told. Her face remained calm, but her hands trembled once, when she saw herself on screen, held down like a criminal, surrounded by people who didn't care what was real. "We're filing the report tomorrow," Morales said. "But the deputy director wants to escalate this. You know what that means." Ayanna nodded. She did. It meant exposure. Media. Testimony. It meant becoming the face of something she had spent her life trying to dismantle quietly. She had wanted justice, not attention. But sometimes, you don't get to choose how justice is delivered. Sometimes, the system needs to be shaken loud enough for the whole country to hear. As the team began gathering files, prepping the next steps, Ayanna sat quietly, staring at the still frame of Darren's hand gripping her arm. The image would stay with her. Not as trauma, but as proof. What none of them knew yet was that the fallout hadn't even begun. That the investigation into Darren would lead to names, patterns, deals that went all the way up. That some of the people she trusted most were hiding secrets they couldn't afford to have exposed. And when it all came crashing down, it wouldn't just be Darren Whitaker answering for what he did. But that's still to come. The hearing room inside the federal courthouse in Charlotte was larger than it looked on television, its wooden panels towering, the rows of empty seats feeling like silent witnesses, ready to absorb the truths about to surface. There was no press allowed inside. Not yet. This was internal, classified, confidential, and closely monitored. The Bureau had moved quickly once the footage of Darren Whitaker's arrest of Ayanna surfaced. But that footage had merely been the spark. What followed was the fire. And now, with Darren sitting stiff in a pressed blue suit, his expression locked somewhere between rage and fear, the silence before the session felt almost ceremonial. The entire room waited, not just to hear what Ayanna had to say, but to finally see what had been hiding behind the badge for years. She stepped into the room dressed not as an agent, not as a victim, but as both. Her hair pulled back, suit sharp, face composed. She didn't scan the room. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where he was. She felt his stare before she saw it, heavy and unrelenting, trying to reduce her to the woman he tried to make disappear. But he couldn't touch her anymore. Not here. Not now. When she sat, the panel began. 3 FBI supervisors. 1 federal prosecutor. 1 ethics compliance officer. And a monitor on the wall where evidence would soon be shown. The air itself felt heavier than usual. Ayanna folded her hands, nodded slightly when asked to begin, and spoke in a voice that didn't shake. She didn't start with what happened to her. She started with what happened to dozens of others before her. She presented arrest records, patterns of misconduct, inconsistencies in reports, physical descriptions that were copied and pasted across different cases. She showed timestamps of body cam footage that had been conveniently deactivated. She detailed witness statements, internal complaints filed and mysteriously misplaced. Each file named Darren Whitaker. Not always the aggressor, but always present, always enabling, sometimes the one who delivered the final blow. And then, she introduced the sealed envelope. The one he never saw. Inside had been the summary of a 2-year covert operation into falsified reports within the Charlotte Police Department. Darren's name had been flagged 6 months earlier. What he didn't know was that Ayanna had been assigned to track him specifically after the Bureau received a civilian lawsuit settled quietly by the city. They didn't tell her his name at first. Only that he was experienced, protected, and had a record of walking away clean. But when she finally saw his file, she remembered the name. She had seen it once before, in a case where a 16-year-old black boy had been hospitalized after resisting arrest. That boy had a shattered wrist and a crushed cheekbone. The charges were dropped. No one was held accountable. Ayanna turned toward the panel and made it clear, her presence at the building the day Darren arrested her was intentional. Not for the arrest, no one could have planned that, but to deliver evidence that would bring him and his collaborators down. She was carrying the final documentation linking his activity to a wider network of abuse that stretched across 3 departments. The file was going to internal affairs. That was the real reason she had been there. Not as bait. But as the blade. Then came the moment the room changed. The monitor on the wall came to life. The video played. Not the one the world had seen. A different angle. One not yet released. It captured Darren pacing in front of her after she had been placed in the cruiser. She was silent, sitting still. And he was monologuing to himself. Bragging. Laughing. Mocking her calmness. Saying things no man in uniform should ever feel comfortable saying. That video wasn't just damning, it was definitive. You could hear his words clear as day, should have seen the look on her face. Bet she's never been put in her place like that. He flinched when it played. In real time, everyone in the room saw his body stiffen, his hands flex on his knees, his jaw clench. Still, he didn't speak. Then came the final blow. Ayanna looked directly at him for the first time. I wasn't in that parking lot by accident, she said. You weren't just some mistake. You were the mission. It was the first time Darren looked afraid. One of the board members turned to him and asked, Officer Whitaker, would you like to respond? His mouth opened, but the words didn't come. His mind searched for authority, some power he used to hold, but it wasn't there anymore. He leaned forward finally and spoke low, bitter. You set me up. Ayanna didn't flinch. No. You set yourself up. I just made sure the world saw it. That broke something. Darren shot up from his chair, eyes wild, voice louder than it should have been in a federal room. You think you're better than me? You think just because you got a fancy title, you get to humiliate me? The security guard behind him stepped forward. The lead agent raised a hand. Let him speak. Darren laughed, but it wasn't real. It was brittle. I've served this city for almost 20 years. I've put away drug dealers, gang bangers, murderers. And you want to burn it all down because your feelings got hurt? You assaulted a federal agent, one of the board members said. I didn't know she was an agent. And if she wasn't, the prosecutor asked, calm, razor sharp. Would it have been okay then? Silence. That was it. He sat down, breathing heavy, his world finally crashing under the weight of truth. There were no words left to protect him. No shield of ignorance. His actions had been documented, dissected, and now, undeniably exposed. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside that room, justice didn't roar, it whispered. It sat in the silence that followed confession. In the faces that finally saw a predator unveiled. And Ayanna, though exhausted, remained unshaken. Because she hadn't just survived him. She had ended him. But what no one knew, not the panel, not Darren, not even Morales, was that Ayanna had uncovered something else. Something inside the files that led to connections far beyond Darren Whitaker. Names that had shown up too many times. Cases where Darren was merely the face, but not the head. The real network, the one built to protect officers like him, was still standing. And she was going after it next. After the hearing ended, the halls of the federal building buzzed not with noise, but with the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. It wasn't over yet, but the air had changed. Darren Whitaker was escorted out, no longer with the stride of a man in control, but with the slow, uncertain steps of someone stripped of certainty. He didn't speak as they walked him down the back corridor. He didn't make eye contact. And yet, even as his career bled out before him, there was something in his posture, a tension, or restraint, that suggested this wasn't the end for him. Not in his mind. Not yet. He wasn't done being angry. He wasn't done believing the world owed him something. That the fall he was experiencing was unfair, orchestrated, the work of some personal vendetta. He didn't see the truth. He only saw betrayal. Ayanna remained seated for a long time after the room emptied. The air was too heavy to stand in. Morales returned and sat beside her without a word. He didn't need to say anything. He saw it in her eyes. The weight of everything. The burn in her shoulders. The exhaustion in her bones. He reached over, placed the sealed envelope on the table between them. The one from the day of the arrest. The one that hadn't made it to its destination because of what Darren had done. But now it was open. Now its contents had started to unravel something even deeper than anyone had predicted. "There's more," she finally said. Morales nodded. "I saw it." "No," she said again, her voice sharper, more precise. "There's more than what's in that file. Darren was just the arm. There's a head. Maybe several. He was protected. Covered. That doesn't happen unless someone made it happen." Morales looked at her carefully. "You want to keep going. It's not a choice anymore." They sat in silence again, the low hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Then Ayanna turned to him, something unreadable flickering behind her expression. "There's someone inside the bureau." Morales flinched. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've seen names. Patterns. Redactions that only make sense if someone higher up approved them. A few of Darren's reports that should have triggered flags, they were cleared. Not ignored. Cleared. Someone with access did that." He leaned forward, voice low. We do it quiet. No reports. No leaks." "I already started," Ayanna whispered. "I just didn't tell anyone yet." "What did you find?" She reached into her folder and pulled out a printed email chain, redacted, time-stamped. A thread of internal memos showing specific officer misconduct complaints, all processed by the same compliance officer. All closed within 48 hours. All involving officers in Darren's network. Morales stared at the paper. "You think it's Jenkins?" "I think Jenkins is the front," she replied. "I think whoever's behind this is 3 layers deeper." He exhaled, his hands moving to his temples. "Jesus, Ayanna. If you're right, I am." The next day, Ayanna walked into the field office and requested a leave of absence. It was a formality. One she knew would buy her time without too many questions. Officially, she was stepping away to recover from internal trauma following an incident involving professional misconduct. Unofficially, she was digging deeper than before. With no leash, no supervision, and no one but Morales quietly feeding her cover from the inside. Her first stop wasn't the precinct. It wasn't the Bureau's data center. It was a retirement home in South Charlotte. She had a contact there, someone who had been part of the Bureau's oversight committee decades ago. Someone who had left suddenly after a series of complaints were dismissed under suspicious circumstances. His name was Leonard Price, and he had been waiting for someone like Ayanna for a long time. He didn't rise when she entered, just motioned her toward the patio where he sat most afternoons. His voice was low and weathered, but sharp as ever. "They finally sent someone who cares," he said, without looking at her. "I'm not here on behalf of the Bureau," Ayanna replied. "That's why you're here," he muttered. She told him everything, what Darren had done, what she found, what she suspected. Price listened without interruption, eyes fixed on the skyline. When she finished, he nodded once. "There's a name you won't find in any of those files. But everything goes through him. Not directly. He doesn't sign off on anything. He just makes sure the right people do." "Who?" "Raymond Delmore." Ayanna froze. Delmore was the assistant director of regional affairs. The one who had personally approved her transfer to Charlotte. The one who had told her she'd been chosen for the task force because of her unique perspective. "He built that protection ring," Price said. "Started when he was in internal affairs. Promoted every officer who played by his rules. Buried complaints. Transferred troublemakers. Created a culture where men like Darren don't just survive, they multiply." Ayanna leaned back, her pulse sharp in her neck. "I can't just accuse someone like that," she said. "I didn't say accuse," Price replied. "I said prove." Over the next 4 weeks, Ayanna worked in silence. She traced Delmore's signature patterns, coded phrases in reports, specific dates when complaints were lost, before magically reappearing reworded. She followed the money, small fund reallocations, legal settlements with victims never filed in public record. Every thread led back to him, but every thread was circumstantial. Until she found the recordings. It was an archived voice memo embedded in an old complaint file that had been misfiled under a civilian's name. A phone call between Delmore and a former officer, now deceased, discussing how to handle difficult black agent causing problems. No names. No dates. But the metadata on the file showed the recording was created exactly 2 weeks after Ayanna had submitted her first misconduct report. She sent it to Morales. They didn't speak. No messages. Just the file. An hour later, he called. "We take it up the chain," he said. "But we need more. You know how this works. We need undeniable. You ready for that?" Ayanna didn't hesitate. "I'm already in it." They met in a parking garage, late at night. Morales handed her a burner phone. "You're not going to like what I'm about to say." "Say it. You need to confront him. Get him to talk. Somewhere he doesn't expect it. Somewhere he thinks he's safe." Ayanna stared at the phone. "You want me to bait him? I want you to do what you've always done, expose the truth. But this time, we record it on your terms." She didn't answer. Just nodded. 3 days later, she walked into a private fundraiser at a country club, an event hosted by a nonprofit Delmore funded. She wore a simple dress. No badge. No gear. Just the burner phone taped beneath her jacket lapel, audio rolling. She approached him during a break between speeches. He smiled the moment he saw her. "Ayanna," he said, as if nothing had ever happened, "you look well. How's the recovery?" She smiled too, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Stronger every day." They made small talk. Laughed. Toasted. And then, as he leaned in closer, she dropped her voice. "I know what you've been doing. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." Delmore's smile didn't falter. But his eyes darkened. He leaned in just a little more. "You think you're the first who's tried? You think the Bureau cares about you more than it cares about itself?" "I don't care what the Bureau cares about," she said. "I care about the people you hurt. You have no proof. I have more than you think." He paused, then chuckled softly. "Then come for me. Let's see how that works out for you." That was all she needed. She turned, walked out, and within 12 hours the audio was in the hands of the deputy director of the Bureau, along with every report, every altered file, and every name Delmore had tried to erase. What happened next would change everything. But for Ayanna, it was just the beginning. The next 48 hours passed like a slow detonation, not loud and explosive, but deep and steady, each second carving out the space where everything that once stood tall would collapse. The audio Ayanna had captured wasn't just damning, it was undeniable. Not just implication, but admission, layered in arrogance and masked threats. It didn't need decoding. It needed air. And once it hit the inbox of Deputy Director Langford, a man who had made a career out of quietly moving chess pieces without letting the world see his hands, it only took one listen. He forwarded it to internal oversight. He scheduled an emergency briefing with the Attorney General. And then, as if to reclaim control of the narrative before it spun out too far, he made a call to Ayanna personally. She didn't pick up the first time. She let it ring. Not out of hesitation, but choice. She needed him to feel that weight. That silence. She needed him to sit with the knowledge that someone had finally outmaneuvered the machine. When she answered on the second ring, her voice was neutral. Langford didn't bother with greetings. "You just broke open something we can't contain." Ayanna let the silence speak for her again. Then calmly, "It wasn't mine to contain. There's going to be fallout, he continued, his tone lower, almost warning. A lot of people are going to get dragged into this. Some of them powerful. Some of them useful. You sure you're ready for that kind of war? I've been at war since the day I was born, she replied. You just didn't notice. When the line went dead, she knew what would follow. Meetings, cover stories, quiet removals disguised as retirements, high-profile resignations wrapped in vague statements about time with family. But she also knew not everyone would go quietly. People like Delmore didn't disappear, they retaliated. They leveraged relationships. And they used silence like a weapon. Still, she was no longer operating in the shadows. What had begun as covert investigation was now full exposure. And the risk wasn't just career damage. It was everything, her safety, her future, her reputation. The Bureau issued a suspension notice to Raymond Delmore within 24 hours. It wasn't public yet. It wasn't even official on paper. But he knew. She could tell by the way he looked at her when they crossed paths in the corridor the next day. Not surprised. Not pleading. Just pure, unfiltered contempt. That look wasn't just about her betrayal of him, it was about his crumbling illusion that someone like her could be beaten into silence. His lips curved in a twisted, almost amused smile, and he leaned in as he passed her in the hall, voice so low only she could hear. You think you've won something, but you've only made yourself a target. Ayanna didn't stop walking. Then aim well. Behind the scenes, the Bureau was fracturing. Quietly, but unmistakably. Agents who once carried themselves with indifference now glanced at her with cautious respect or strategic distance. Some of them feared what she represented now. Not just the truth, but the reminder that the truth could wear a badge, speak fluent Bureau, and still burn everything down if necessary. Others began to come forward, agents who had buried complaints for the sake of advancement, or who had turned blind eyes to practices that had always felt wrong but had always been explained away as tactical necessity. Morales stood by her side through it all. But even he was shifting under the weight of what they were uncovering. Late one evening, while reviewing a batch of internal memos cross-referenced with Delmore's digital footprint, he sat back in his chair, hands rubbing his face in disbelief. We're not talking about just corruption anymore, he said. This is a structural design. Generational. It's not a flaw in the system. This is the system. Ayanna nodded, her eyes tired but unwavering. That's why it has to be dismantled. But what happens when the people who built it start pulling strings to protect it? Morales asked. You think Langford's going to let this go public? He doesn't have a choice, she said. Because I'm not waiting for permission anymore. The line between justice and vengeance blurred that week. Each revelation bled into the next. Each truth uncovered revealed 5 more buried. And for the first time, Ayanna began to feel the full emotional toll of it. She was no longer just chasing the facts, she was living inside the consequences. The victims in those files weren't statistics anymore. They were names, faces, voices in her dreams, each one reminding her that the longer this network thrived, the longer their stories remained erased. But there was a new complication. Jenkins, the compliance officer they had previously believed to be just a pawn, had gone silent. Not fired. Not resigned. Moved. Transferred to a quiet administrative desk in another region. Langford called it a containment decision, something to keep the press from sniffing too close. But Ayanna knew better. Jenkins knew everything. He had seen the emails, approved the redactions, signed off on the patterns. And now he was buried somewhere safe. She wanted to find him. She wanted to confront him. But she also knew that going after Jenkins now would expose her to retaliation she wasn't fully prepared to fend off. Not yet. The public still didn't know. The media hadn't gotten wind. She was operating in that fragile space between exposure and silence, where one misstep could close every door permanently. In one of their late-night conversations, Morales said something that stuck with her. Sometimes the hardest part of justice isn't finding the truth, it's deciding how much of it to release when the system isn't ready to hear it. She didn't respond then, but she carried those words with her into every meeting, every conversation, every stare she exchanged with agents who now looked at her like a walking mirror they didn't want to face. She saw herself becoming something she hadn't planned, an icon, a symbol of resistance inside a structure built to suppress it. And with that came the pressure of expectation. People wanted her to fix it all. To stay strong. To never slip. But she wasn't a machine. She had scars, and some of them were fresh. One night, she sat alone in her apartment with the TV muted, watching footage of herself walking out of the courthouse on a loop. A camera had caught her expression, a mix of defiance and weariness. Social media had turned it into a symbol. People were sharing it with captions like, "Truth has a face," and, "She didn't just stand her ground, she dismantled his." Strangers saw her as power. But only she knew the cost of holding that image. The pressure culminated when she received a call from a civil rights organization asking her to speak at a national conference on systemic reform. They wanted her story. They wanted her words. But most of all, they wanted her to embody something larger than the Bureau. Something the country could rally around. She said yes. Not because she wanted the spotlight. But because she knew the narrative needed a face the system couldn't dismiss. And if that face had to be hers, so be it. As she prepared her speech, she faced her deepest dilemma yet. How much truth could the world handle? How much could she say before they tried to silence her again? And more importantly, how much did she owe to the people who had trusted her with their silence? She rewrote the speech 4 times. Each draft sharper. Each version more dangerous. Until she finally stopped writing and started remembering. Every name in those files. Every face. Every voice. Every time someone told her she didn't belong. Every time someone like Darren made her feel invisible. She poured it all into her final version. And on the day of the conference, as she walked onto the stage with lights blinding her and a crowd of thousands holding their breath, she knew this was more than testimony. It was the beginning of the reckoning. But the end, well, the end was still coming. And it would hit harder than any of them were ready for. Ayanna stood backstage, her fingers gently clutching the edge of the podium note she wasn't even sure she would use. The hum of the crowd was thick through the curtain, not chaotic, not loud, but heavy, a collective silence waiting to be broken by truth. The Civil Rights Summit had drawn over 2,000 attendees, and not just advocates and activists. There were lawyers, federal officials, reporters, victims' families, and quietly, in the background, figures from the Bureau pretending to be observers while they monitored every word. Morales sat in the second row, his arms crossed, not out of defiance, but solidarity. He hadn't said much since they arrived, but she knew what his presence meant. He was ready to stand with her, regardless of what followed. The host announced her name, and the applause was immediate, fierce, heartfelt. Ayanna took the stage slowly. Not to dramatize it, but because every step carried the weight of what she was about to unleash. When she reached the podium, the applause faded, not out of disinterest, but reverence. She looked out across the crowd, scanning rows of expectant faces. Some looked tired, others angry, but most carried a deep, personal hope. That this wouldn't be just another speech. That this time, someone would say it plain. She didn't read from her notes. "My name is Ayanna Brooks," she began, her voice low, clear, unwavering. "I'm an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I'm here today not because of my title, but because I was placed in handcuffs by a fellow officer who didn't know who I was. He only saw what he wanted to see, a black woman who didn't belong." The silence deepened. But that moment, what he did to me, wasn't unique. It was a pattern. One that I've spent the last year investigating from the inside. And what I found wasn't a few bad apples. It was a culture. A network. A system designed to protect the men who believe power is a license to humiliate. She paused, letting the weight of that land. Most people think injustice is loud. But it's not. It's quiet. It hides behind paperwork. Behind redacted files. Behind the language of procedure. And it survives because we let it. Because we're afraid to burn it down when it's built into the foundation. In the third row, a woman began to cry. Ayanna saw her, held her gaze for a moment, then continued. I've read hundreds of files. Watched hours of footage. Interviewed victims who were called liars. Officers who were silenced. I've seen names disappear from databases. I've seen settlements signed in rooms with no windows. I've seen careers built on the backs of broken people. And I'm not standing here today to make peace with that. I'm standing here to say no more. The room broke into applause, not out of politeness, but because they felt it. The rawness. The rage. The relentless clarity in her voice. But Ayanna didn't flinch. She raised her hand gently to silence them again. There's something I didn't put in my official report, she said. A name. A man who orchestrated much of what I uncovered. He's been suspended, but that's not enough. His name is Raymond Delmore. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't write the false charges. But he built the house. And unless we hold the architects accountable, the violence will continue. Gasps. Whispers. Journalists scribbling. Phones recording. Ayanna leaned in closer to the mic. I'm asking every federal authority watching this, every agent listening, every citizen in this room, demand better. Not tomorrow. Now. Because accountability delayed is justice denied. The crowd erupted. Ayanna stepped back from the mic and walked off stage as the lights dimmed. People reached for her hands. Some shouted thank yous. Others just cried. But she didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't victory. It was exposure. And exposure always comes at a cost. Backstage, Morales met her with a nod. You just put your career on the chopping block. I know, she said. But you did what no one else had the courage to do. I did what had to be done. They didn't say more. The noise behind them was thunderous now. Her name was already trending. News outlets were running with headlines like FBI agent breaks silence on internal corruption and Brooks exposes bureau power ring. And somewhere, Ayanna knew, Delmore was watching. 2 days later, a subpoena arrived. Ayanna was called to testify in a federal inquiry initiated by the Department of Justice. It was official now. No more hiding behind confidentiality. She would speak under oath. And her testimony would not be sealed. That terrified some people. Especially those who had built their careers on complicity. Langford called her again. This time, his tone was different. Less commanding. More concerned. There are people inside the bureau who want you gone, Ayanna. They see you as a threat to the institution. I'm not a threat to the institution, she replied. I'm a threat to the corruption hiding inside it. You're making enemies. Good. I can't protect you. I never asked you to. They hung up. She wasn't surprised. Langford had always been loyal to preservation. She wasn't interested in preserving anything that needed protecting from the truth. The day of the testimony came fast. Federal courtrooms were not new to her. But sitting on the witness stand as a whistleblower was a new position entirely. Cameras weren't allowed, but reporters lined the hallway. Some of the faces watching her were familiar, old colleagues, supervisors, even Delmore himself sitting behind the defense counsel with the tight, rehearsed look of a man preparing to play innocent. The lead prosecutor opened the session. Agent Brooks, are you prepared to testify truthfully to all matters discussed today? I am. The questions started professionally, details about her role, her investigation, the scope of her assignment. But quickly, they shifted into what she had exposed. Specifics about the memo trail. The audio recording. The patterns. The culture. Were you ever pressured to alter your findings? Yes. By whom? My direct supervisor at the time. Through veiled suggestions, not explicit commands. Did Raymond Delmore ever contact you directly regarding your reports? Yes. He told me to focus on low-impact cases and avoid what he called institutional assumptions. Do you interpret that as an effort to protect misconduct? I interpret that as an effort to suppress accountability. Delmore's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the answer. Ayanna's voice never wavered. She spoke each word with precision, but never venom. That was the power of her truth, it didn't need theatrics. Then came the final question. Agent Brooks, do you believe the Federal Bureau of Investigation is capable of reform? Ayanna took a long breath. She looked out across the courtroom. Then back at the panel. I believe any system built by people can be rebuilt by people. But not if we keep excusing the cracks. Not if we keep telling victims to wait for progress. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from confrontation. So yes, I believe reform is possible. But only if we're brave enough to start it. And ruthless enough to finish it. With that, her testimony ended. As she walked out of the courtroom into the flash of a dozen cameras and the blur of shouted questions, she didn't feel victorious. She felt clear. Like something had finally shifted, not just around her, but inside her. She wasn't just exposing the system anymore. She was becoming something it couldn't ignore. And that terrified the people still hiding in the dark. But for Ayanna, fear was no longer the enemy. It was fuel. Ayanna's life changed in a way she hadn't anticipated, not from a single act of retaliation or a headline gone viral, but through the slow, creeping realization that she had stepped into a place no one survives without scars. Each day after her testimony brought new weight. Some of it was visible: constant phone calls, unmarked vehicles parked near her building, warnings from sympathetic voices inside the bureau who told her in coded language that certain offices were quietly digging into her past, looking for anything to smear her credibility. But the heaviest parts weren't those. The real burden came from knowing she had exposed something that would never fully go back into hiding. She had burned a curtain. What lay behind it would haunt a system long after her name faded from headlines. There was one night that defined everything that followed. Morales had called, not from his desk or cell, but from a secure line at a third-party location. She could hear it in his voice, tension layered with urgency. He asked her to meet him in person. Not at the bureau. Not even at a public cafe. He chose a small apartment near the outskirts of Charlotte, one that belonged to a cousin who'd moved out of state. When she arrived, Morales didn't greet her with a handshake or a smile. He simply pulled open the door, locked it behind her, and walked her to a table where a laptop sat open with a paused video on screen. They've started scrubbing files, he said. Not just from Charlotte. From Atlanta. Richmond. D.C. Ayanna blinked slowly, processing. Delmore's network? No, Morales said, meeting her eyes. Langford's. It didn't make sense at first. She had believed Langford was the reluctant middleman, someone who wanted to protect the Bureau's image but wouldn't go so far as to bury the truth. But as Morales played the footage, everything sharpened into focus. An internal Bureau meeting, low-res surveillance footage with audio. Langford in a private room with two high-level administrators. They were discussing media strategy, damage control, and ways to publicly isolate Ayanna's actions from the Bureau's institutional identity. He called her a rogue voice. Said she had emotional motivations. That they needed to contain her influence before the media rebrands her as a modern-day martyr. Ayanna leaned forward, hands slowly curling into fists. She could feel her breath growing slower, tighter. He used my testimony, she said, to build a wall around the rest of them. Morales nodded. They're going to spin this. Say you were unstable. Say you were acting without full intel. Say your emotional investment made your work unreliable. They're going to discredit the investigation. They already started. The complaint logs are being sanitized. Agents who backed your findings are being reassigned or given administrative leave. Quietly, like a cancer being cut out. Ayanna stood, walking away from the table, her hands pressing against her temples. They don't care that we proved the corruption. They just care about surviving it. That's how they've always survived it. She turned to Morales, her eyes sharper than he had ever seen. Then we leak everything. He froze. Ayanna, no more redacted summaries. No more careful negotiations. If they're going to come for me, they're going to have to bury me under every name they protected. We leak everything. The memos. The emails. The recordings. Even the audio with Langford. Every lie they told the public. Every cover-up. All of it. Morales hesitated. We do that, you'll be finished in the bureau. Possibly indicted. You know that, right? I'm already finished, she said, voice breaking only slightly. At least this way, I finish something that matters. They spent the next 3 nights building a digital war chest. Morales encrypted every file, layered firewalls, created mirror drives in case one was deleted. Ayanna wrote a manifesto, not dramatic, not preachy, just the truth. Cold. Documented. Unapologetic. She wrote it in the same tone she'd used in her reports. Professional. Precise. Relentless. And at the end, she signed it not with her title, but with her name. At 3:22 a.m. on a Wednesday, the leak went live. It hit first on independent media outlets that Morales trusted, ones that didn't answer to corporate sponsors or government influence. Then it went viral on social platforms. By 5 a.m., Ayanna's face was trending again. But this time, so were the names of officers, administrators, and high-level bureau officials who had enabled years of abuse. There was no way to spin it. The receipts were too detailed. The audio too clear. The strategy too overwhelming to be dismissed as personal grievance. Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice issued a statement. A full federal investigation was reopened, not just on the Charlotte division, but across every district named in the files. Langford was placed on leave. Delmore was subpoenaed again. Jenkins vanished entirely, his last known location traced to a small port in Florida. Internal Affairs was turned inside out. And still, Ayanna received no apology. No formal recognition. No medal. Just silence. She moved out of her apartment. Went dark. Morales coordinated safe houses through private contacts. Journalists flooded her inbox. Civil rights organizations called her a hero. Protesters chanted her name in front of federal buildings. And in the middle of all that, Ayanna sat in a rented room with the lights off, listening to a voicemail from her mother. I saw you on the news, baby. I don't understand all of it, but I know you did something right. I know you made them look at us different. You always were brave. Just come home when you can. We miss you. She listened to that message 6 times. Each time, the lump in her throat grew harder to swallow. Not because she doubted her actions, but because she'd never wanted to be seen as brave. She just wanted to be respected. Protected. Heard. A week passed. Then another. Slowly, the heat around her began to shift. Not cool off, but refocus. People started talking less about her and more about the system she had exposed. Legislative hearings were scheduled. Funding structures were reevaluated. Training protocols were rewritten. And in those quiet administrative steps, Ayanna saw something she hadn't expected. Change. Not perfect. Not fast. But real. Then came the letter. Not from the bureau. Not from the government. From a girl. 17. Black. From South Carolina. She wrote about how she wanted to join the FBI one day. How she'd thought that dream was stupid until she watched Ayanna stand in front of that courtroom and refuse to break. How she printed out Ayanna's testimony and kept it folded in her backpack. How it made her feel like maybe she wasn't crazy for believing that the system didn't have to stay the way it was. Ayanna cried when she read it. For the first time since the day she was arrested, she let herself cry without restraint. Because that girl's letter reminded her of why she had taken every risk. Not for revenge. Not for a career. But for someone who hadn't been silenced yet. Someone who still believed it was worth speaking up. She picked up her phone and called Morales. I'm ready. For what? To finish what we started. It didn't happen overnight. Justice never does. But months after Ayanna's leak, the wheels of consequence began to move in ways no one could stop. Raymond Delmore, once protected by layers of titles and allies, faced indictment on federal obstruction charges. The evidence was too vast, too interlocked, and too public. He walked into court in silence and walked out in handcuffs, the cameras catching his blank stare as if he still couldn't believe the world no longer bent to his design. His name was stripped from every office door, every press release, every folder where he had once scribbled dismissals in ink. But the real punishment wasn't the prison sentence he would eventually serve, it was knowing his empire had crumbled at the hands of a woman he underestimated. The same woman he once tried to erase. Langford never stood trial, but the cost was steep. He quietly submitted his resignation under pressure, packaged with a vague letter of personal health and family focus. But internally, he was barred from stepping foot in any federal office again. His contacts dried up. The promises made in backrooms disappeared. His silence had finally reached its expiration. And unlike Delmore, he would live the rest of his days in the shadow of what he failed to stop, his name a warning instead of a legacy. Darren Whitaker's fall was quieter, but heavier. After the internal investigation concluded and the public outrage refused to die down, he lost his pension, his badge, and the support of the union that once protected him. He filed an appeal. It was denied. He tried to sue for defamation. It was thrown out. He sat alone in a small apartment outside city limits, watching his own footage play on repeat across social channels, each view a nail in the coffin of his authority. No one in the department returned his calls. And perhaps worst of all, his daughter, the one person he believed would always believe in him, had stopped answering his messages. One day, she posted a statement online. I'm not proud of who my father became. I'm proud of the woman who stood up to him. He never responded. Morales took a new post, head of internal integrity, a newly established division created as a direct result of Ayanna's testimony and the public reckoning that followed. He built a small team, handpicked for ethics and resilience, and made it clear their job was not to protect the Bureau but to protect the truth within it. And he did it quietly, away from the cameras, knowing the real war was in the unnoticed details, reports filed correctly, voices heard without needing to shout, agents trained to act instead of look away. Ayanna? She didn't go back to the Bureau. Not because she couldn't, but because she had already won in a different way. The world no longer saw her as just an agent. She became a speaker, an advisor, a mentor. She didn't chase titles. She built bridges. She helped form an independent coalition that audited law enforcement departments across the country, made up of lawyers, community leaders, former officers, and investigators who'd lived the failures of the system and refused to let it continue. She walked into rooms where she used to be invisible and now commanded silence. She trained future leaders. She showed young black girls that strength wasn't about how loud you spoke, but about how deep your truth ran. And 1 year to the day after her arrest, she returned to that same parking lot. She parked in the same space. She stood in front of the building and closed her eyes. The air felt different. Lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally shifted. A crowd had gathered, not protesters this time, but students, community members, reporters. She didn't give a speech. She just stood, holding the sealed envelope that had once been her burden. And then she opened it, not for herself, but for everyone who never had the chance. Page by page, she read the names. And when she was done, she said only 4 words: "They will be remembered." Because that was the legacy. Not scandal. Not destruction. Remembrance. Dignity. Truth. Now I want to ask you, what would you do if the system meant to protect you was the one that harmed you? Would you stay quiet? Would you keep your head down? Or would you risk everything to make sure the next person didn't have to carry that same pain? This story is more than just a twist of fate. It's a mirror. And sometimes, the hardest part of looking into that mirror is realizing how much power we've given to silence. But you're not powerless. You're a witness. And if Ayana's story moved you, if it lit a fire in you, then don't let it stop here. Speak. Share. Question everything. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, need to be heard, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the truth deserves more than a moment. It deserves a movement.